Okay, Ezra and the Rosh Hashana that changed Jewish history. I want to start actually from a statement in the Rosh. Very simple question. What kind of day is Rosh Hashanah? A happy day, a sad day, a nervous day, a day of tension, a day of judgment? Malchios, we talked about it the last couple of weeks. Malchios, Zechonos, and Shofros. We talked about God as King. We talked about coronation. What kind of day is Rosh Hashanah? The Rosh writes in the name of Rav Haigon, asking a very simple question: is one allowed to fast on the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah? Is one allowed to accept upon themselves a fast day? After all, like Yom Kippur, should have the same atmosphere as Yom Kippur. And so he writes, "V'nira divrei Rav Hai shekatav," with regards to lehit anot, fasting on the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. B'shnei yamim tovim shel Rosh Hashanah, anu ro'im sheyafehu shelo lehit anot. I think it is preferable, says Rav Hai, quoted by the Rosh, not to fast. Shekach amru parnasei Yisrael rishonim liYisrael, because that's what the early leaders of Israel said to Israel. And we'll talk about who they are in a moment. On with regards to Rosh Hashanah, ichlu ma'adanim v'shtu mamtakim ki kadosh hayom. Eat and eat good food, drink good drink, because today is a holy day to God. Ki kadosh hayom la'Adonai. So from that, the Rosh paskins, and it's brought down on the Shulchan Aruch, that one is not allowed to fast on Rosh Hashanah because it's a yontif, and there's a mitzvah to be joyous on yontif and to eat. Just as, and we'll see where this source comes from, that's our first reference to our story in Ezra. In addition, he quotes a Yerushalmi, Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi is a very famous quote, and I've given you the actual original text of the Yerushalmi below in source 2. Ezehu umak umazot, what kind of a people is this, a special people? Benoag sheba'olam adam yodea sheyesh lo din, lovesh shchorim, mitatef shchorim, mekadel zkano. Person who normally stands in judgment, dresses in black, he wears black headdress, he lets his beard grow, meaning he's in a state of mourning or concern or worry. Doesn't know what the outcome of his judgment will be. But Israel is not like that. We wear white clothes, which is one of the sources for wearing a kittel. We wrap ourselves in white, and we shave and trim and groom ourselves in preparation for this day. Ochlim v'shotim usmechim. We eat and we drink and we're joyous. Why? Because we know that God performs wonders for our people, meaning that we are confident in the outcome of our judgment. That's the Yerushalmi, quoted by the Rav Yah, quoted by the Rosh, that says, on Rosh Hashanah, not allowed to fast, it's a day of simcha, and it's a day of achila v'shtiyah, eating and drinking, including the phrase that we quoted earlier, which is a slightly incorrect quote, but I'll show you the original in a moment. And the original comes from Nehemiah Perek Chet. And we're gonna look at these chapters in much greater detail, the whole chapter, but I just want to look at this one tiny quote for a moment just to see where this comes from. What's going on in Nehemiah Perek Chet? Why is this relevant to Rosh Hashanah? All of that will become clear as we progress. But I want to start with the simple quote. Nehemiah Perek Chet, as you know, books of Ezra and Nehemiah are one book in our Masorah, and so they both talk about the story of both Ezra and Nehemiah. ויביא עזרא הכהן את התורה לפני הקהל מאיש ועד אישה וכל מבין לשמוע. Ezra, HaKohen, right? Ezra, the priest, brought the law before the congregation. He brought the Torah to them publicly, to hear, to listen, to read. B'yom echad lachodesh hashvi'i, on day 1 of the 7th month. Right? What's day 1 of the 7th month?
Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah.
This is the story. So this is what's happening on Rosh Hashanah of this particular year. Vayomer Nehemiah at Tirshata, ve'Ezra Kohen HaSofer, the two of them together, Nehemiah and Ezra, are standing there leading the people, and all of the Leviim, And hamivinim et ha'am l'chol ha'am, the Levites who taught the people, and all the people, they're all standing there, and he's telling them, the Nehemiah and Ezra and the Leviim and the instructors are telling the people, Hayom kadoshu l'Hashem Elokechem. Today is a holy day to God. And because today is a holy day, it's Rosh Hashanah, al titablu, al tivku, you're not allowed to mourn, you're not allowed to cry. Now, that's relevant because as the people were listening to the Torah, they began to cry. So here's Ezra and Nehemiah here reading the Torah to the people on Rosh Hashanah. The people are crying. We'll see why, because they don't know what the Torah says. They're ignorant, and they're hearing it ostensibly for them the first time, and they're crying. Says Ezra to them, "No, you're not allowed to cry. It's Rosh Hashanah. It's a holy day." And he says to them, "L'chu ichlu mashmanim ushtu mamtakim." Go and eat good food and drink sweet drinks. V'shilchu manot la'ein nachon lo, and send gifts to those who don't have. Right, that's the famous expression which also appears in Megillat Esther. Mishloach manot ish l're'eu. Right, you have a similar phrase here. V'shilchu manot la'ein nachon lo. Ki kadosh hayom la'adonenu. But today is a joyous day for our Master. Don't be grieved, don't be sad, for the joy of God is your strength. The Leviim also wanted to encourage the people to say, don't be grieved, don't be sad. So that's what they did. And so the people went on Rosh Hashanah, they went home and they had eat and drink and portions and great celebration. Rosh Hashanah was a day of joy. So says Ezra and Nehemiah and the Leviim to the people. And on that basis, the Rosh paskins that you're not allowed to be sad on Rosh Hashanah. You have to eat, you're not allowed to fast. And Rosh Hashanah, even though it's a day of judgment, and even though it's all of the things we talked about, it is a day of simcha before God. Similarly, the Mata Ephraim, who was one of the main kind of collectors of all of the customs and laws of the davening of Rosh Hashanah, writes with regards to the sequence of Tefillah and Rosh Hashanah in Minhag Ashkenaz that after Avinu Malkeinu, Omer Hashliach Tzibur Kaddish Shel Siluk Al Titkabel, right? There's a Kaddish Tiskabel, there's an ending Kaddish at the end of the Tefillah. V'nogin l'nagen b'nigun yafeh. And the custom is to sing this Kaddish in a beautiful, uplifting melody. L'harot she'anu betuchim sheberachamav yadin otanu l'kaf zchut. To prove, it's a reflection of this confidence that we will emerge victorious in the judgment. It's a source for a very interesting custom, which we all see, we all do, and we all kind of intuit, which is the famous. There's a beautiful, energetic melody to the Kaddish at the end of davening on Rosh Hashanah. Of all days, Rosh Hashanah should have a kind of a sad, nervous kind of melody or experience in the prayers. Says the Mata Ephraim, based on this Rosh, based on all of these sources, that no, on the contrary, we have an element of simcha and joy, and the melodies of the Tefillah, certainly of the Kaddish, should raise us up in our spirits and in our confidence. So from this story, I really want to begin to explore this Rosh Hashanah. What happened on this Rosh Hashanah, and what's going on in Sefer Ezra and Nehemiah as a whole, that kind of led up to this moment of Ki Kadosh Hayom La'Adonenu, the recognition of the atmosphere and the character of Rosh Hashanah. I also want to point out, as a kind of a parenthesis, the phrase Ki Kadosh Hayom La'Adonenu is a phrase that should be familiar to us if we are familiar with the davening of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Even if we're not familiar with Sefer Nehemiah, it's a phrase we sing or we say in the davening. In the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah, a very famous paragraph, Od yizkor lanu avat etan Adonenu. Will yet be remembered on our behalf the love of Etan, the strong one, referring to Abraham, by our master, by our God. And in the sake of Yitzchak, who let himself be bound on the altar, God will put an end to our judgment or our struggle, meaning we will be victorious. And in the merit of the pure one, the perfect one, the revered one will bring forth a judgment on this day, meaning this is a paragraph that reflects the merit of Zchut Avot Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Ki kadosh hayom la'Adonenu. But today is holy to our master. Ki kadosh. Meaning, this together with a whole bunch of other phrases, which will come across over the course of the next two shiurim, whole bunch of phrases that are built on the story of Ezra and Nehemiah find themselves in the davening itself, and that's no accident. Much of the language of our prayer, much of the language nusach of our tefillah comes from pieces of Ezra, Nehemiah, Daniel too. We talked about that a little bit when we studied Sefer Daniel. And that's not an accident, because part of what the period of time was known for, and we'll identify that period in a second, was the composition of the basic concepts of tefillah, the formulations of tefillah, the language of tefillah, the structure of tefillah is also part of this period of time. And so the fact that many of the words, phrases, or concepts of our nusach of our davening are taken from here, that's not an accident either. And hence what I have entitled this, it's 2-week series, right? This is part 1 and next week is part 2, is Ezra and the Rosh Hashanah that changed Jewish history. Where do our prayers come from? The notion that the source of our tefillah, or many of the concepts of our tefillah, are part of this story in particular. So let's take a kind of expand our view for a moment and take a look at what's going on in Nehemiah Perek Chet. So just to identify how I'm going to do this year, I've put on the source page some of the texts from Tanach. Most of the sources are, as we usually do, rabbinic sources. The actual texts from Tanach that we're going to be looking at are going to be on the various tabs that I'm going to show you from Ala Torah. At the end of this section, I've given you a list of all the sources that I've pulled from Tanach. So if anybody wants them, they're in the middle of page 2. You can kind of go back and take a look at them. So we're going to jump for a moment to Nehemiah Perek Chet. This is the story that of the first Rosh Hashanah. The people all gathered themselves to the open plaza that was before the gate of the Shar Hamayim, which is the gate that they used to go down to the Shiloach to gather the waters for Nusach Hamayim. And they instructed Ezra to bring the Sefer Torah and to read it publicly. So Ezra the Kohen brought to the people, men and the women, and all who could hear, on the first day of the 7th month, Rosh Hashanah. Two things that are interesting about this moment, this ma'amad, or this significant moment in history. First of all, what is the significance of the fact that the emphasis that Ezra HaKohen brought to the Torah and that Ezra read the Torah, so one of the things we're going to look at is the fact that for the most part, the only ones who were capable, right, the only ones who were educated enough in Jewish life to be able to read scripture at that moment in time, essentially were the Kohanim. And that's part of the story that we're going to unravel or try to understand. And so he brings the Torah. And for half the day, Ezra sat or stood and he read the Torah to the people in the presence of the men, the women, all who could understand. Yoznei kol ha'am el sefer HaTorah. The people's ears were all attentive to the book of the law. Very similar to the concept of Hakel, right? Or the mitzvah to gather all the people together after Sukkot and for the king to really read the parts of the Torah, which is modeled after Ma'amad Har Sinai. So you have a sequence of Ma'amad Har Sinai in which the Torah is presented to the people, the mitzvah of Hakel, in which on a regular basis, every 7 years after Shemitah and Sukkot, Aliyah Regel, they would read parts of the Torah. Here's Ezra HaKohen gathering all the people together on Rosh Hashanah to read the Torah to the people. Ezra stood on a big podium and a big pulpit. I'm not going to read all the names of the people who stood with them. Sefer Ezra and Nehemiah are notorious for lists of names. Whether that's relevant or not, we'll see. And was there a question? No. Vayiftach Ezra Sefer le'enei kol ha'am, ki me'al kol ha'am haya ukefitcho amdu kol ha'am. Ezra stood above the people, and he opened the people, and the people all stood up. There's a whole discussion whether we should stand for Kriyas Torah on the basis of this text. Vayivarech Ezra et Hashem Elokim HaGadol v'yanu kol ha'am amen amen b'mo yedehem. Ezra blessed the people, he blessed God, and the people answered amen, amen, and they did so with their mo yedehem, their hands lifted up. That's what mo yedehem means. They bowed to the ground. Then there's a list of people: Yeshua, Bani, Yeshua, Yamin, Akub, Shabdi, all these Nipli, and the Levium, and all the people all stood. Vayikra'u b'sefer Torah Elokim miforash v'sum sechel v'yavinu b'mikra. They read the book. They gave it sense. They taught it. They translated it. They explained it. There's much to unpack in that verse. Please God, that's part of our agenda for later for today. The notion that they didn't just read the Torah, but they also had to explain the Torah, because the people didn't necessarily understand what they were hearing. It needed to be translated, it needed to be explained. And then Vayomer Nehemiah hu et Tirshata v'Ezra Kohen HaSofer, and then the texts that I just read before, which is the psukim that Nehemiah then turned to the people together with Ezra, and he said, okay, now go home. They were standing in this court for half the day. Now go home and now eat. And another halacha we learned from this moment, which is the minhag of taking our tefillot past midday of the day, but then having to go make sure that we go and have a yontif meal. And that's exactly what they do. On the second day, argue second day of Rosh Hashanah, if that was already in place at that time, unclear. On the second day, all the leaders, all the peoples, the priests, the Levites, all gathered together to Ezra to understand the words of the Torah. And there they read about Sukkot. And so they had to go and celebrate Sukkot, and they were fulfilling the mitzvot as they were learning them, because this was a generation that was ignorant of anything in terms of Jewish tradition. This was the generation that had, more or less, a generation that we'll see that in a second, had returned, and they were now beginning to re-establish the connection to Torah and to Jewish life. They learned about Rosh Hashanah. Now they're learning about Sukkot. There's a whole discussion as to what happened to Yom Kippur, but for the most part, Yom Kippur at that point in time was essentially a day that was relevant only to the Mikdash. There was no public involvement in the avodah of Yom Kippur. That came much, much later. Yom Kippur in Tanach, in Chumash, in terms of its role, was essentially a temple-centered world. But in terms of mitzvot that the people were involved in, besides the simcha of Rosh Hashanah and the eating, was the mitzvah of Sukkot, and so they had to go and the whole discussion of the Sukkot that they built, and they Reexamining, and they continued to read in the Torah Vayikru b'Sefer Torah Elokim Yom b'Yom min Hayom Harishon ad Yom Ha'acharon v'yasu Chag Shivat Yamim Yom HaShmini Atzeret K'Bishpat. So you have Rosh Hashanah, you have Sukkot, you have Shmini Atzeret. Again, what happened to Yom Kippur? It's not relevant to part of our discussion here, but it's part of the story because of the fact that it was temple-centric rather than the people. And then from here directly, I'm not going to read it all, but from here directly, you move into the 24th of the month of Tishrei, and now there's a whole new ceremony that get back together, and there's a whole discussion. We'll see as time progresses what that was about. So this revolution, really, there's no way to describe it short of that. Really, this is a moment in which the people have returned to the land of Israel. They've built, for the most part, a functional temple, and yet there's such ignorance, mass ignorance across the board. They don't even know what Rosh Hashanah is. They don't even know what Sukkot is. And they have to have this public ceremony to read them, to teach them, to understand what is this day. And their reconnection or recommitment is part of this story. That's why I call it the Rosh Hashanah that changed Jewish history, because it was a generation that stood at the crossroads. They could have been lost to history. That would have been the end of Torah. It would have been the end of Jewish life. This was the only left remnant of the Jewish community, right? The community that stayed in Bavel is gone forever. It's the community that was now in the land of Israel. Ezra and Nehemiah were leading, and they were, and they were dealing with the people that are completely ignorant. We'll see. They were involved. They had Gentile wives, and they had culturally adopted certain idolatrous practices, and it would require of Ezra and Nehemiah full effort to literally to change the entire nature of the generation. And it's a series of efforts to get rid of the non-Jewish wives and to get rid of the influence of the idolatry and to reestablish the connection to Torah. This is essentially the story of this period of time around which Rosh Hashanah is one of those moments where you have this kind of significant event. Now, the story of Ezra, Nehemiah, to some extent Daniel, to some extent the Nevi'im of the time, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, we have a general term for this whole period of time. And it's referred to in the language of Chazal as the period of the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, the men of the Great Assembly. And that's really what I want to talk about. I want to talk about this institution that we refer to in the language of Chazal, in the Mishnah, as the Great Assembly. What is the Great Assembly? Who is the Great Assembly? Where does it come from? What did they accomplish? What did they do? When did they live? It's a fascinating piece of history because there's some parts of it that are fundamental to our life today, and yet we don't really have a strong grasp of what we're talking about when we talk about the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah. What's the clearest or most direct connection between modern Jewish life and the structure of the institution called the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah? Anybody know? Well, let's put it this simply.
The Knesset, no? We call the Knesset after that.
Yeah. The Knesset is called after the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah. That's half the picture. The other half of the picture. Institutions of leadership in Jewish life are typically made up of either a Navi or a Melech, or a Beit Din, or a Sanhedrin. One of the great mysteries of this period of time is that Chazal identified the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah as being comprised of 120 people, which is the source for why the Knesset is 120 seats. Right? Not more, not less. The modern Knesset in Israel is modeled after the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah of the Second Temple period, which is fascinating because we have no reference to the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah in Tanach. It would seem, right? They were talking about the period of Ezra and Nehemiah, and there's no reference to them here as the Great Assembly. We know of the Great Assembly, or we know of the Knesset Hagdolah from a number of rabbinic sources. For example, the most famous is the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot.
Yeah.
And here I'm going to, we're going to spend some time in the source pages. So again, if anybody wants a copy of the source pages, then I would just copy them out of the chat. I think that should be them. Okay. And we're going to talk about all. I don't know the questions in the chat, but we're going to get to a lot of the. I'm dropping a lot of information. And it's one of the reasons why I want to teach you for this series, because there's a lot to unpack. So it's this week and next week. Mishnah Pirkei Avot. Everybody knows this Mishnah. Moshe kibel Torah Sinai, Misra Yeshua. Moshe received the Torah at Sinai. He gave it to Yeshua. Meaning, what do you mean he gave it to Yeshua? He gave it to Yeshua in the sense of the responsibility for the transmission of the Masorah went from Moshe to the leader of the next generation. The leader of the next generation was Yeshua. From Yeshua, it went to the Zkanim. Who are the Zkanim? It's another name for the Zkanim, the elders.
Shoftim?
Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin.
No, not Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin is a
Oh,
second
no,
temple
no,
institution.
That was before.
The
Shoftim.
Shoftim. The Shoftim. Uzkanim leNeviim. So we're still in the period of Tanach. The Nevi'im gave the Torah responsibility over to the Nevi'im. And the Nevi'im masru al anshe Knesset Hagdolah. And the Nevi'im handed it over to the men of the Great Assembly. And what did the men of the Great Assembly do with the Torah? Hem amru shlosha dvarim. They said three things. What were the three things that they said? Revolutionary ideas. Have be patient in judgment. Hemidu talmidim harbe, have many students. Yasu siyag laTorah, make a fence around the Torah. Okay. Out of them, all that build-up of the Torah from Sinai to Yeshua to the Shoftim to the Nevi'im to the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, all of that build-up, and what is the contribution of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah? They said, be patient in judgment and teach many students and make a fence around the Torah. It's like one of those Mishnayos which is such a letdown, because you have all this buildup and anticipation for something big. And what seems to be reflected here are important ideas, but I'm not sure that they're that big ideas that have to do, on the face of it, have to do with the core of the Masorah and the transmission process of Torah from Moshe to the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. So I put that out there as a question. One of the big issues we have to address is the understanding of these three statements. But who are the Knesset Hagdolah? When did they live? Where did they live? So as we begin to explore rabbinic literature, we see a little more information. For example, Avot Rabbi Natan. Avot Rabbi Natan is more or less a braita on Pirkei Avot. It's sort of like an expanded version of Pirkei Avot, similar period of time, but it's a braita that kind of picks up and adds more information. In the Avot Rabbi Natan, we find the statement, Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, Kiblu michagai Zechayahu Malachi. At the Great Assembly, are part of this Masorah process. They didn't just get the Torah, Masorah of the Torah from the Nevi'im. It's not just the prophets in general, but three prophets in particular. Chagai, Zechayahu, Malachi. Now, what's special about Chagai, Zechayahu, Malachi that links to the Masorah of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah? Chagai, Zechayahu, Malachi are the beginning of the Second Temple period. They are the last Nevi'im that we have. They close the text, the book of Tanach, of Nevi'im. And therefore, when you say Anshe Knesset Hagdolah received the Masorah from Chagai, Zechayahu, Malachi, what you're really saying is that the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah is the leadership of Israel just after Chagai, Zechayahu, Malachi, the transition from the world of Nevi'im to the world of leaders who aren't Nevi'im. Ezra, Nehemiah, we'll see them specifically mentioned. Right? They weren't Nevi'im. They were Chachamim, they were wise, they were scholars, but they weren't Nevi'im. And that's the big transition. That's the big change. That no longer the domain of Nevi'im, now Torah is being led by, taught by, encouraged by non-Nevi'im. Ezra's a Kohen. Nehemiah is a representative of the government, right? But they were devoted to a leadership of the people. And what did the Anshe Knesset Agdola say in this capacity? Three things. Again, same three items we'll come back to another time. Another observation. Based on a number of sources together, the Bartanura, Rav Avadim Bartanura, comments on the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. Who were the Anshe Knesset Agdola? What were they? When were they? Where did they live? It's such an amorphous definition, Anshe Knesset Agdola. So Rav Avadim Bartanura says that there are 120 zkenim hayu. There were 120 elders, scholars. Why 120? We'll see in a moment. And they included, now listen very carefully to the names, because the names are fascinating. Zerubbabel. Who is Zerubbabel? Zerubbabel is the governor of Judah, as appointed by the king of Persia to lead the Jewish people back to the land of Israel. He's a descendant of the house of David. Right? He's a descendant of the house of David. He's the beginning of Sefer Ezra. And we're going to see exactly who Zerubbabel is. Then we have Srayah, Eliah, not sure who they are, it doesn't matter. Mordechai Balshan, who is mentioned in Sefer Ezra, unclear if that's the same Mordechai as the story of Esther or not. Leave that for now. Sheyibim Ezra, they were all in the days of Ezra. Ukisha'alu min hagolah b'bayit sheni, when they returned from the exile in the Second Temple period. Umichlalam, and included in the assembly, Chagai, Zechayahu, Malachi, the Nevi'im of that generation, Chagai, Zechayahu, Malachi, Unechemiah ben Chachlaya v'chavrehem, and together with Nechemiah ben Chachlaya and his friends. In other words, what, as the Bartanura suggested, is the Anshe Knesset Agdola's time period, from the beginning of Shivat Zion through, unclear through how much time, but that's who they are. And they include every name you can imagine from, or leader that you can imagine from that world. Zerubbabel and Chagai Zechayahu Malachi and Ezra and Nehemiah. Basically, anybody who's anybody in the Second Temple period is part of this Anshe Knesset Agdola. The fact that there are 120 comes from a Gemara in Megillah. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, 120 zkenim, 120 elders. Ubehem kama neviim, together with a number of prophets. So that's Chagai Zechayahu Malachi together with Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah and everybody else. Tiknu Shmona Esrei brachot al seder. They were the ones who established the Shmona Esrei. So now already we have a new bridge. A new bridge. We had three statements they made in the Mishnah and Pirkei Avot, right? Those are the three big contributions of the Anshe Knesset Agdola. Establish many students and be patient in judgment, etc. And now suddenly we have a new institution of the Anshe Knesset Agdola, namely they established the Shmona Esrei, which basically means they formulated the foundation of tefillah. And that's exactly what the Gemara in Brachas says. Amar le Reb Shimon bar Abba le Reb Yochanan, Michte Anshe Knesset Agdola tiknu lahem liYisrael brachot tefillot kedushot v'havdalot. Our whole structure of every part of our relationship with God that is expressed through words, tefillah, brachos, the concept of kiddush, the formulation of havdalah, the language of our relationship with God, the words we say are formulated by the Anshe Knesset Agdola. That's an enormous contribution. I mean, that's a revolutionary contribution. Remember, when we went to exile after the First Temple, we didn't have any tefillot that were formulated, that were structured, that had a text. Not brachas, not tefillah, not kedusha, nothing. Right? We had a relationship with God. We had avodah in the Beit HaMikdash. And that's why the world was so temple-centric. Comes along Ezra and Nehemiah and Anshe Knesset Agdola, the Second Temple period, and suddenly there's a room for a Beit Knesset, there's a room for tefillah, there's a room for personal expression of a relationship with God outside of the world of the temple, which is in and of itself a remarkable contribution. Again, compared to or added to the list of the three things that they did in the Mishnah we have to explore, this is the time period that we're dealing with. Now, I'm still unsatisfied with this 120. And this 120, I don't know why, it bothers me. We have no institution in halacha, in the Torah, that is made up of 120 people. We have a Beit Din of 3, we have Shivim Zkenim, we have 70 elders in the time of Moshe. How do we come to 120? Question number 1. Question number 2 is, when did they live? Now, according to, here we enter into a very, very controversial issue, which is that chronologically, you're familiar with the fact that there's a certain gap in Jewish history. Right? Chazal, in the midrashic literature of their accounting of Tanach, only account for the names of the Persian kings that are mentioned in Tanakh. So any event or history or king or reference that doesn't appear in Tanakh does not appear in midrashic literature. And so from that perspective, we are more or less the period of the Persian, from Koresh until the entrance of Shimon HaTzadik and the entrance of Alexander the Great into Yerushalayim, is more or less a period of 52 years, according to the Medrash in Seder Olah. Whereas we know from historical sources that that period of time, Persian Empire, is more or less a period of about 200 years. And so if the Anshe Knesset Hagdola is functioning from Ezra through Shimon HaTzadik. Why through Shimon HaTzadik? Because what is the next Mishnah? What does the second Mishnah in Pirkei Avot say? That Shimon HaTzadik, Mishiarei Knesset HaGdolah, that Shimon HaTzadik, who meets Alexander the Great at the entrance to Yerushalayim, was of the last of the generation of the Great Assembly. Right? That's the second Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. I didn't put that on the source page. I apologize. Which means that to Chazal, the Knesset HaGdolah lasted 52 years. It's one generation. But historically, and that's very difficult to process historically. Most scholars agree that that's just very difficult to process. But I'm not getting into the midrashic issue of the calendar, but it would seem from most certainly academic and historical sources that we have that the Persian Empire more or less lasts for about 200 years, from Koresh to Alexander the Great. And if that's true, then the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah is not one generation. It's multiple generations. It's an institution of leadership that lasts 200 years. From the beginning of Shivat Zion, Chagai Zechariah Malachi, all the way through till Shimon HaTzadik, Mishiarei Anshe Knesset HaGdolah. You're talking about over 200 years. 200 years that starts with, even before Ezra and Nehemiah, it starts with Chagai Zechariah Malachi, it starts with Zerubbabel, and lasts all the way to Shimon HaTzadik. That's an extraordinary period of time. Where did the number 120 people come from? Where are they sitting? Where are they gathering? Who are they? And of 200 years, they said 3 things: be patient in judgment, establish many students, and make a fence around the Torah, and maybe the composition of tefillah. That's the contribution in 200 years. I need to understand who Ezra is, who Nehemiah is, who the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah are, to really process what this story is about. So we're going to go through the background of this history of this period of time and try to understand a little bit better what the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah was. But I'm going to make the assumption, and this is, again, controversial, you can agree with it or not agree with it, but I'm going to make the assumption for this purpose, for this discussion, that we're going to adopt this sort of historical approach to that period of time in the Persian Empire, and that the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah is not one generation. It's a title given to the institution of leadership of the Jewish people from the beginning of Shivat Zion until the beginning of the sages of the Mishnah. And then in that entire gap, which could be up to about 200 years, when you didn't have prophets anymore, and you didn't have named sages, institutions of the Beit Midrash. It took time for the Beit Midrash and for the leaders of the Beit Midrash, or the leaders of the yeshiva, of the yeshivot of Bavel and the land of Israel, of the scholars of the Mishnah, Shimon HaTzadik and Hillel and Shammai, and all of the Batei Midrash that developed from there. It took time, and that time, that 200 years, is the period of the Knesset HaGdolah. Where does the number 120 come from? So I'm going to offer two possibilities, and I think they're both valid, but I just fascinating observations. There is a suggestion put forward by Rav Shlomo Goren, Zatzal, in his Sefer Torah Moadim, that it was a combination of all of the institutions of leadership at that time. Namely, there's the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin is made up of how many members?
70.
70 plus the Av Beit Din, which is 71.
71. Yeah.
Then you have a Sanhedric Tana, a small Beit Din. The smaller Beit Din is made up of 23 sages. There was one in the Beit HaMikdash in the Lishkat HaGazit, and there was one in the entrance to Yerushalayim. So he claims that there were two Sanhedric Tana in Yerushalayim, plus the three Nevi'im, Chag, Zechariah, Malachi, who are identified as part of that time period. So 71 plus 46 plus 3 equals 120. And so Rav Goren says that's how they came up with the number of 120. But we have no evidence that the sages sat over a period of time for 200 years in a body or institution called the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah that was comprised of 200 members, of 120 members, of which we don't know their names. Right? It's an interesting number to put it mildly. Here's another suggestion that I saw in an article written by Rav Yoel Ben Nun. He claims, and this is very powerful, but you have to work through the text, that the number of sages, the number of representatives, or the number of people in the Great Assembly, is not because at any given time over the course of 200 years, 120 people gathered in one place. It's a number given to the total number of names listed in Sefer Ezra and Nehemiah. Rav Yoel claims that he went through the entire book and counted every individual name in all the lists of names that appears and took out all the duplicates. Now that's where it gets complicated. And based on that list, he says, there are a total of 120 individual names mentioned in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, and they are listed here on this source page, source number 3. I've given you the text upon which he bases it, which is various quotes in the Sefer Ezra with a list of names, and the names that are in bold are the ones that are unique, meaning not repeated, and it comes to a total of 120. You can go through the math, you can check it, you can second guess it, not my issue. But what he does say, and I think this part of it I agree with 100%, it's not for me to agree with Yoel, right? But Yoel taught us in this context that the Great Assembly was the leadership of Israel from the days of Chag, Zechariah, Malachi until Shimon HaTzadik. The number 120 refers to that first generation, Ezra and Nehemiah, and all the names of the people who are listed there as part of the leadership. There were 120 of them. That doesn't mean that 120 people gathered every 6 weeks for a session of the Great Assembly. It means that 120 is a reference to the Great Assembly as a concept, as a leadership. Starts with Zerubbabel, it moves to Ezra, it moves to Nehemiah, later it'll move to other scholars and other sages. We don't know who they are, but they are the continuation of the Great Assembly for all the generations up to the beginning of the time of the Mishnah, namely up to Shimon HaTzadik. And it's that Great Assembly, it's that institution of leadership, Ezra and Nehemiah, that gathers the people together on Rosh Hashana in that fateful year to finally address the mass ignorance and assimilation of the generation that came back from Bavel. That's the story of the Rosh Hashanah that changed Jewish history. So, quick synopsis of the background. How did we get here? The story of Shivat Zion begins in Ezra chapter 1. Let me just pull up. Part of what we did, right? The notion that in the beginning of Sefer Ezra. Actually, let's do this. I'll come back to it. Right, first year of Koresh, king of Paras. God inspires Koresh to make this declaration, and in this declaration, he says he's going to give the Jews the authority to go back to the land of Israel and rebuild the temple. Great. Who leads our people back from Bavel to build the temple? It's Book of Ezra. So who do I anticipate is leading the people back from Bavel to the land of Israel to build the temple? Somebody say it.
Ezra.
Ezra, right? Wrong.
You would think.
You would think. Ezra's nowhere to be seen. Ezra doesn't come into the picture until chapter 7. In chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, the leader of Israel is 2, namely, let's see if, I don't think you can.
Nehemiah. You have Nehemiah come.
No, not
No,
yet.
Nehemiah came much later.
Zerubbabel, and
Zerubbabel.
Zerubbabel. We'll get there. All right. The two leaders of Israel are Zerubbabel ben Shaltiel, who is the governor, Pachat Yehuda, is the governor appointed by the king of Persia. He is the descendant of the house of David. He represents the Malchut, the political leadership of Israel. And Yehoshua Kohen HaKadol, and Yehoshua ben Yotzadak, the Kohen. Those are the two leaders, the political leader and the religious leader, the descendant of the house of David and the Kohen HaGadol, and they lead the people back in the time of Koresh. And then you have the whole story. They start to build the temple, and there's the locals, and they object, and they write a letter to Koresh, and he rescinds his edict, and then you have the Yavesh. I'm not going to get into the whole story. Fascinating story, conversation to have, not our issue for now. What I want to go to is Sefer Zechariah. Zechariah Perek Bet. Remember, the Nevi'im who accompanied this process are Chagai and Zechariah. Right? They're very clearly mentioned in the book of Ezra as part of this process. There's some discussion about Malachi. I'm going to leave Malachi now for a moment. And when he lived and who he was, not our issue. But in Sefer Zechariah, we find the following reference to Roni v'simchi bat Zion, ki hineni ba v'shachanti b'tochech. God says to the people of Israel via the prophet Zechariah, rejoice, sing, daughter of Zion. I come and I will dwell in your midst, and great nations will come to you. And they will come and they will join my people. And I will dwell in your midst. Has kol basar mivnei Hashem. Be silent, all flesh. This is great anticipation. This is great moment in history. The return of the Jews to the land of Israel to build their temple. Similarly, in the Sefer Chagai, starting with Perek Aleph, Bishnat Shtayim l'Daryavesh HaMelech, the sixth month of the second year of Daryavesh. God came to Chagai and said, the message of God through Chagai and Navi, to El Zerubbabel ben Shaltiel Pachat Yehuda, El Yehoshua ben Yotzadak Kohen HaGadol. Two great leaders, Zerubbabel ben Shaltiel, the governor, and Yehoshua ben Yotzadak. And what does he say to them? And he says to them, you have to build the temple. They were procrastinating. Not a subject for now. This is all relevant to, if we were studying Sefer Ezra, this would be relevant. But now it's just background. But I want to jump to Pasuk Bet. Vayishma Zerubbabel ben Shaltiel v'Yeshua ben Yotzedek Kohen Gadol. Zerubbabel and Yeshua, they heard, they understood, and all the rest of the people, v'chol shevita am, and they heard the words of the Navi as sent them, and they feared God, and they did as he instructed. Vayomer Chagai Malach Hashem b'malchut Hashem la'am lemo ani etchem. God says to them, I'm with you. And Vayar Hashem et ruach Zerubbabel ben Shaltiel, he inspired Zerubbabel ben Shaltiel, and he inspired Ruach Yoshua ben Yotzedek Kohen Gadol, and inspired the spirit of all the people, and they came and they built the temple. And you have to wonder, the disconnect is that people who are talking to Nevi'im, who are engaged with God, who are building the temple, and Ezra and Nehemiah stand there with people who are assimilated and married into Gentile wives, with Gentile spouses, and they have no idea what Rosh Hashanah is? The disconnect is extraordinary. Something's not right. Something's missing. And if you go to Perek Bet of Chagai, on the Bashvi'i, 7th month, right? We just said they never heard of Rosh Hashanah, right? We just said that people never heard of Rosh Hashanah. Bashvi'i, Besim Echad HaChodesh, on the 21st of the month on the 7th month, Hashana Rabbah, for those keeping track. Hayad v'Hashem miyad Chagai lemor. He said, and when Zerubbabel ben Shaltiel, tell Zerubbabel, and tell Yoshua ben Yotzedek, and tell the rest of the people, saying, Mi b'chem anishar asher ra'at habayit hazeh b'chodo rishon, you who saw the first temple in its glory, and you who are so disappointed, what you see now, you see is nothing in your eyes. However, don't be disappointed. Chazak Zerubbabel, be strong Zerubbabel. Chazak Yoshua, be strong Yoshua. Chazak kol ha'am ha'aretz, go be strong, the people of the land, because I am with you. And he goes on and he says in Pasuk Vav, Ko amar Hashem tzvot od achat ma'ati, ani marish et hashamayim v'et ha'aretz v'et hayam v'et ha'charava. We're this close. We're this close. In just a little bit, I'm going to turn our people in the world around, and you're going to be a great nation. This house is going to be greater even than the first house. This is what we're dealing with. And now a couple of psukim later, in the end of the month, he comes back to them. On the 24th of the month, and he says to them, go tell Zerubbabel, the heavens and the earth are going to turn upside down and shake. I'm going to overthrow kingdoms. And I'm going to destroy the strength of nations. Etc. You, Zerubbabel, you, my servant, I'm going to take you. And I'm going to make you like a king. I've chosen you. All hopes on Zerubbabel, all hopes on Yoshua ben Yotzedek. Second year of Koresh, beginning of the period of Dayavish. And then we go to Ezra, Perek Vav, it's chapter 6. Ezra, chapters 1 through 6, the whole story of Zerubbabel and Yoshua coming to the land of Israel, dealing with in local turmoil, dealing with people who don't want to build the temple, dealing with the local population, the indigenous population that go and tell the king of Persia that the Jews are rebelling against them, and all of that is happening in the generation of Zerubbabel and Yoshua. V'yasu Chag HaMatzot Shivat Yamim. This is the end of chapter 6. This is still about Zerubbabel and the temple. They build the Mizbeach and they start to bring offerings. V'yasu Chag HaMatzot Shivat Yamim Basimcha. They fulfill the mitzvah of Sukkot, of Chag HaMatzot, of Pesach. Ki Simchat Hashem. V'esev lev melech Ashur aleim lachazek yedehem b'melechat bet Elokim. They can build the temple. This is amazing. They finally built the temple and they can bring sacrifices, bring offerings. Wonderful. Next chapter. All of that was the period of Dayavish. Now the period of Artaxerxes. In the period of Artaxerxes, in the 7th year of Artaxasta, ויעלו מבני ישראל מן הכהנים והלוויים והמשררים והשוערים והנתינים על ירושלים, comes Kohanim and Leviim and singers and porters, the Shoarim are the ones who open the gates of the temple in the 7th year of Artaxasta. And with them comes Ezra ben Snaya Kohen. Ezra HaKohen arrives in the land of Israel in the 7th year of Artaxasta. And shortly thereafter, in the first chapter of the book of Nehemiah, we find Divrei Nehemiah ben Chachlaya v'b'chodesh Kislev shnat esrim, in the 20th year of Artaxasta, and he's still in Shoshana Bira, and Artaxasta says to him, okay, it's time, and he hears V'yavo Hanani echad me'achai, and he hears a report of what's going on in the land of Israel. And I inquired of the Jews who had escaped, the remnant of the Jews who are in the land of Israel, were left from captivity concerning Yerushalayim. Listen to that word for a moment. And he said to me, the remnant left from captivity there in Yerushalayim, in the province, they are in terrible distress. They are greatly afflicted. They are greatly shamed. The wall of Yerushalayim is destroyed. And the gates burned by fire. I'm totally confused. We went from Dayavesh to Artaxasta in one breath from chapter 6 to chapter 7. In year 7 of Artaxasta, Ezra comes. In year 20 of Artaxasta, Nehemiah comes. And what do they find? They find mass assimilation. They find nobody knows what Rosh Hashana is. They've never heard of Sukkot. They've never heard of the temple. They don't know their right from their left. They've never heard of the Torah. They don't know what it says. This is the same people who just a minute ago we said was celebrating Pesach in the Beit HaMikdash because they finally built the Mizbeach. We went from Koresh, Dayavesh, Artaxasta. We went from what to the other? That's the first mystery. The second mystery is that from Ezra chapter 7 until the end of the book of Nehemiah, besides dealing with the assimilation and the intermarriage and the mass ignorance, and they don't know their right from their left, there's not a single reference to Zerubbabel ben Shaltiel and not a single reference to Yeshua ben Yotzadak. They simply disappeared. This is one of the greatest mysteries in Tanach. The gap between the state of the Jews between chapter 6 of Ezra and chapter 7. And I think the explanation that I've learned and I've heard, which I think makes the most sense, is that in between, remember, Nehemiah is talking about, where is that text in Nehemiah? Nehemiah is talking about here, he's talking about not just he's getting a report in Shushan about the state of the Jews in Yerushalayim, and he hears about Shevi, captivity. He hears about fire, the temple, gates broken, burnt by fire. It would seem, and there's no reference to this in Tanakh, but it would seem that in the failure of the generation that came back, I'm going to stop sharing because we're going to finish here and then I'll do the rest next week. But in the failure of the generation that came back under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Yeshua, they were encouraged, they were inspired, they were pushed. The Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi a little bit, they fail. What brought about their failure is unclear. But we know they failed because Malachi, who's assuming part of that contemporary world, closes the book of Nevuah. The last sentence of Malachi is Zichut Torat Moshe Avdi, because Nevuah is coming to an end. So remember the book, the story of, remember the book of the Torah, because there's no more Nevuah. It's sealed, it's closed. Malachi seals Nevuah. So from that perspective, whatever took place, the anticipation that the Shekhinah would return to the temple and that Gadoya Kvod Habayit Hazeh Acharon Min HaRishon, this temple will be greater than the first temple, all of that comes crashing to a fate we don't know of. Evidently a Tisha B'Av style catastrophe that destroyed the temple, that destroyed Yerushalayim, that sent the Jews who had just returned from Bavel, who sent them into captivity. We don't know by whom, and we don't know when. All we know is that if we take the historical account, there's about 6 of Dayavesh. The transition between Dayavesh and Artaxerxes is about 60 years, which means there's a 60-year gap during which time the state of the Jewish people in the land of Israel goes from great anticipation to total destruction. Ezra and Nehemiah return to the land in which the remnants that remained have they have no idea what's in the Torah. They've never heard of it. They've never seen it. They don't know what Rosh Hashana is. They've never heard of Sukkot. Ezra opens up a Sefer Torah, begins to read. The people are in tears. How many years later? 60, 70? Rabbi say 70 years we were in Bavel. Right? Doesn't take more than 60 or 70 years to take a generation of Jews who are knowledgeable, who are traditional, who are educated, and to completely remove from them any remnant of Jewish life. We saw it in the Soviet Union. 70 years of the Soviet Union, 3 generations, and the next to the 3rd generation know nothing of Jewish life. That's exactly what happens to Ezra and Nehemiah. They come back to the land of Israel, bring the people together. They're married to the local non-Jews. They're married to Ammonites. They're married to Moabites. Nations were not allowed to marry. They're assimilated into the cultural milieu of the world, because for 70 years after whatever anticipation there was under the leadership of Ezra, of Zerubbabel and Shealtiel and Yoshua, collapsed. That Churban, that destruction, is not recorded in Tanach. No, we don't know why, but it's clear that there was an enormous gap between the time of Zerubbabel and Yoshua and the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, come Ezra and Nehemiah and 120 members of the Knesset Agdolah, meaning the leadership of that generation, and their task is to rebuild Judaism and rebuild Torah out of the remnants that are left. They set themselves a trajectory and a course of history. That course, that trajectory, that goal can be articulated, can be summarized in 4 things. And that's what we're going to pick up next week. Those 3 statements of the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, I believe, are the cornerstone of the program, the platform, the agenda of the Anshe Knesset Agdolah to rebuild Jewish life in the land of Israel in the aftermath of this catastrophe. And the 4th, which is not in that Mishnah for some reason, is the story of Tefillah, and that's what we're going to address, B'ezrat Hashem, next week. So this is part 1, and part 2 is still coming.
Thank you so much
For joining us.
Question,
And hope
thank
you'll
you.
join us next week.
Go
question,
have our seats.
question.
Yeah.
What happened at that time during those 60 years to most of the people that were left behind in Babel? And those were the good people.
Well, we're not quite sure who the good people and the not good people are. They begin to dwindle. We don't know much about. We know there's a Jewish community in Bavel. throughout the Second Temple period. We don't know a lot about them. There's not a lot of communication about them. There are certain evidences we have in this Masoret and Chazal that even during the Second Temple there were communities in Bavel, but we don't know a lot about them.
But Yechezkel was there. I mean, they couldn't have forgotten.
Before Yechezkel is part of Galut Bavel. The 70 years during the exile, the whole community is there. Yechezkel is before that. This.
Do we know which kind of people came? It could be that the people that came, not a lot came. A lot of them stayed in Galut. So it could be that the people that came were knowledgeable to begin with. That it's not
question, but at least at the first number of years, there are Nevi'im, there's an anticipation of building the temple, there's a celebration of Chagim, right? By the time Ezra comes along, there is nothing left. And that's the big mystery.
Okay, but if you take the historical approach, in between is Achashverosh and Purim.
And Achashverosh and Purim is for sure part of the earlier part of that period of time. That is true. But
Thank you very much.
But Eli, one second. It's true that's part of that period of time, but it's according to everybody, it's pre-Ezra.
That's what I'm saying. It's in between the time that the people were stopping.
Correct, but it's still pre-Ezra. My focus next week is going to be from Ezra on. But yes. Okay, folks, have something to think about for the next week. Zat Hashem, we'll see you next week.
Thank
Thank you very
you.
much.